Hello, I'm Mike Shavers, CEO of Yellowstone Boys and Girls Ranch. I'm pleased to introduce the first module of the YBGR Native American Cultural Competencies curriculum. This module is about the history of American Indians and the tribes that were here long before the United States was created and Montana became a state. There is also information about each of the 8 tribes and 7 reservations currently in Montana and the disparities that continue today. At any given time, 20 to 25% of the seriously emotionally disturbed youth served by YBGR are Native American. To better support these high-risk youth, YBGR has established Native American support services as part of our psychiatric residential treatment facility milieu. We hope to expand this to our community-based services division in the future. This curriculum is intended to bring more awareness and understanding to YBGR staff about the trauma and hardships that American Indians have faced for over 260 years. This trauma and hardship continues today for many Native Americans, particularly the youth we serve. A wider audience could benefit from better understanding of Native Americans who are such a valuable part of our communities and state. Our hope is that for anyone who watches this video, it will bring more awareness. I want to thank Georgette Bojo and Elk River Law for providing this historic information and presentation. Also Bill Snell and Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders Council for supporting the project financially and for his guidance throughout production.
Hello, my name is Georgette Hogan-Bojo. I am an attorney with Elk River Law Office. It's a firm that specializes in federal Indian law and representing tribes and tribal individuals. I have been an attorney for approximately 20 years, much of my career spent dealing with child welfare in a variety of roles, from representing the state of Montana in dependency and neglect cases, to representing tribes and Indian Child Welfare Act matters, to serving as a guardian ad litem in dependency and neglect. I am an enrolled member of the Crow tribe. I grew up on the reservation. I am here today to present the history of American Indians and Montana reservations. This presentation is meant to be a high-level review of the American Indian experience in the United States, as well as how reservations, particularly in Montana, came to be. It is not meant to be an exhaustive review of the experiences, as there are books that can be written on each of the areas that I am talking about today. However, this is meant to give you a context and a greater understanding to help you improve the provision of services that you give to American Indian families and children that you work with on a daily basis. This training is divided into 5 sections. The first section is the history of American Indian tribes. Section 2, why reservations were created. Section 3, life in boarding schools. Section 4, an era of change in the United States. And Section 5, specifically on Montana reservations. In the first section, regarding the history of American Indian tribes, when the early British settlers came in, there was a very specific viewpoint to the relationship with American Indians. The British Proclamation of 1763 sets that forth. King George III declared in 1763 that the territory beyond the eastern mountain ranges was off limits to settlement and was reserved for the tribes. Based on this premise, tribes could sell the land that they had to various groups and individuals directly. So early on, the British recognized tribal sovereignty. They viewed tribes as governments or individuals who coalesced to be able to have title to land, to be able to sell that land. That attitude changed after the American Revolution. The Indian tribal status changed after the 1776 U.S. Declaration of Independence legally. After the Revolutionary War, the 1776 Declaration of Independence specifically vested Congress with the exclusive authority to regulate trade and commerce with the Indians, while before, individual Britons could deal directly with tribes, purchase land from them. This was interpreted very early on in a series of cases called the Marshall Trilogy. They were early U.S. Supreme Court cases that addressed the status of tribes in the United States. These early cases embedded several principles that formed the foundation and established the nature of how the U.S. government dealt with tribes even to this day. Indian tribal status changes after the Marshall Trilogy. The Marshall Trilogy of cases established the founding principles of the tribal-federal relationship and institutionalized the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery established that colonists discovered and were entitled to land in the Americas. This doctrine of discovery was embedded in one of the first Marshall Trilogy cases, in which the early U.S. Supreme Court essentially said because the colonists had discovered and conquered the Indians, that they had discovered the land, that Indians did not possess title to the land, that only the United States could deal with the conquered individuals as was set up in the Declaration of Independence. It undid all those early land sales that had been done under the early British rule, and it embedded a moral principle that is known as manifest destiny. Indian tribal status changes after the 1776 U.S. Declaration of Independence. The doctrine of discovery was based on the moral principle of manifest destiny. European settlers were divinely entitled to conquer and control North America. This justified the dispossession of Indian lands and extinction of those tribal people who resisted civilization. These early principles supported the ideal that the U.S. was to civilize and protect the tribes, forming the ward relationship between the U.S. and the tribes. This protector role outlined in the early cases provided little protection by the United States for tribal people in their territories, and the pressures of westward migration of settlers seeking more land exceeded the protection that tribes received. So, in the early Marshall Trilogies, the cases were set primarily in Georgia. Georgia was emboldened after the election of the President Andrew Jackson, who was considered not favorable to tribal people. Georgia took several actions, one including to prohibit non-Indians from entering the reservation without consent of Georgia officials. Indian Removal Act of 1838. President Andrew Jackson refused to enforce cases recognizing tribal sovereignty and made Indian removal official U.S. policy. So the state of Georgia was emboldened by the election of Andrew Jackson, who they saw as a champion to their interests and as unfriendly to the American Indian interests. At that time, there was a minister who was settled on the Cherokee Reservation who was very friendly to tribal sovereignty and tribal rights. The state of Georgia had passed a law that non-tribal members, non-Indians essentially, could not be on the reservation without consent of the state of Georgia. This minister made a specific concerted effort to be on the reservation. He was arrested and his case was appealed to the Supreme Court about who had the authority to control tribal lands. The case itself could be seen as a simple, easy victory in the sense that it determined that the Cherokee tribe had control over who could be on their lands and who could not. However, embedded in this were those, again, early principles of manifest destiny and the doctrine of discovery, where in this case and the following cases, the Supreme Court made clear that they saw tribes as less than full sovereigns, that they were considered dependent ward nations that were subject to the protection and control of the United States at the federal level. In fact, these cases offered little practical protection to the tribes themselves or the minister who sought to help them enforce their sovereignty and tribal rights. Spent, I believe, 11 years in prison and was not released by the state of Georgia. So although these cases did recognize to some degree sovereignty, it did not change the experience of American Indians and the push by settlers for land. Indian Removal Act of 1838. Several removals included the infamous Trail of Tears, a military-assisted voluntary removal of Cherokees from their homes in Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina, and Georgia to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. It is estimated 4,000 to 8,000 died as they were forced to move between August and December 1838. They were promised food as part of the move and provisions to assist them, but many of these did not come through. The vast majority of deaths were caused by starvation, illness, and exposure due to the timing of the forced march. This was a specific embedded policy of Andrew Jackson's presidency and was devastating. The tribes involved in the March of the Trail of Tears still do a 2.5-mile retracement trail along the original route. There's a segment at Pea Ridge National Military Park in Garfield, Arkansas, that they use to commemorate their experience in this very traumatic event. This policy, again, was embedded early on in the United States relationship with tribes. Initially, there was a Department of Trade that was set up to manage trade relationships with the tribe. Later, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, known as the BIA, was established in 1824 under the War Department. Later, in 1849, the BIA was transferred to the newly created Interior Department. The BIA's roles and duties evolved as the country evolved. The BIA's role and relationship with tribes has changed and evolved as the United States relationship with tribes has changed through history. Currently, it's very exciting for many tribal members that Secretary Deb Haaland made history when she became the first American Indian to serve in a president's cabinet as the Secretary of Interior in March 2021. We will now move on to the second section in which I will talk in more detail about why reservations were created. The establishment of Indian reservations was to restrict the movement of tribes and end nomadic lifestyle of many tribes, and to allow for the westward expansion of U.S. colonists and remove Indians from traditional territory that was desirable for settlement. As the United States grew from a young nation and began to be more populated, the push for settlement and to have profitable land for the early colonists grew. The way that the early European settlers viewed land was very different than the way that tribes viewed land, the way that tribes used land. Not all tribes were nomadic, but many were nomadic, and they would move from area to area, covering a large geographic area that they used in common for hunting and gathering. There were some farming tribes, but they also would move quite a bit. So again, the land use was very, very different. The early Americans wanted individual property to farm and to progress. And so that started an early conflict in the eastern part of the country that spread westward. Part of the impetus to control the conflicts that were beginning to escalate between tribal nations with this pressure by individual settlers who wanted land was the creation of reservations to try to contain those tribes in smaller areas to reduce the conflict and expand the land available to those early settlers. Oftentimes, tribes were placed in less desirable areas that were not as useful for farming or have as much access to water or other natural resources as those were often desirable for settlers. The United States established approximately 326 Indian reservations in 1890, which totaled a little over 56 million acres. Not every state has a reservation in it, so these are just where tribes were placed, sometimes in their Aboriginal traditional territory and other times where they were pushed based on settlement. Before the buyback program, which has recently occurred, there were still 56 million acres of tribal trust land, of which 44 million was tribally owned and 11 million individually owned. Montana has 5.9% of its total land in tribal trust land, and 16 states do not have federally recognized tribes or reservations within their boundaries. As you look at this map of the United States, you can get a sense of, in the dark brown, where tribal territories and reservations were established. As the pressure for land increased and the Indians were placed on reservations, it was a total transition for many tribal folks in how they lived and gathered. Because of the restriction and lack of access to traditional hunting grounds and gathering grounds, many Indians began to starve and suffer significant poverty. In order to deal with what was considered the Indian problem, the General Allotment Act of 1887 was passed. After the creation of reservations, many tribal members suffered extreme poverty and were starving. Reservation boundaries severely limited access to traditional gathering and hunting. Indians became severely dependent on government rations for survival. Rations were nutritionally inferior and limited in quality. Further, Indians were learning to cook completely new and unfamiliar foods. The General Allotment Act was passed to deal with the Indian problem. The stated intent was to assist Indians using available resources to become self-sufficient farmers, assimilate Indians, and weaken the role of tribal government. The act opened reservation land to homesteading and allowed the land to be taken out of trust, opening the reservation to land speculation. As the Indians were placed on reservations, they became significantly dependent on United States rations for food. These rations were often types of food that they were not familiar with, that it took them time and struggle to figure out how to eat, how to process, and how to manage. These were generally lard, they would get hardtack, flour. It was a complete shift from the type of food that they were used to eating. The General Allotment Act was to change American Indians into farmers so that they could begin to produce and successfully provide food for themselves. And the thought was, if they were given individual allotments of land in which they could farm, that they would then be able to sustain themselves and not be dependent on United States rations. This was the overall intent that was presented at Congress. However, within there also was the interest, again, as westward expansion was increasing, that even the land that was within those lands set aside for Indians, that there was much interest in that territory. While land was set aside for tribal members and tribal use, there were many non-tribal individuals interested in settling, farming, and accessing that land. So after the Marshall Trilogy, the recognition of the tribes as wards of the United States set up the trustee role of the government towards tribes. What this did was this created a wardship status and a special status for land so that it was held in trust and it was not accessible and it was not alienable by the tribal folks. It was held as a group. It was held for the tribe as a whole, and they were to use it as a whole, and it was owned for their beneficial use by the United States government. What the General Allotment Act did was it provided a process to divide up the land into farmable portions by American Indians, and then what was not allotted was allowed to be open to homesteading for early American settlers. And so that was also, again, one of the underlying interests of the Allotment Act, beyond the stated purpose to help American Indians become self-sufficient. Allotment of land required the compilation of formal tribal rolls. This was done by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, known as the BIA, but the act provided no guidance, so the process was ad hoc. The stated purpose of blood quantum was to identify individuals entitled to an allotment benefit, but blood quantum was not defined. The real purpose of blood quantum was to breed out Indians. As you divided the land into parcels, the United States government needed a way to identify which individuals were entitled to these individual farming parcels. So that's where blood quantum was institutionalized. While the United States had used blood quantum in various areas, it was not widespread or integrated into the government process. As earlier said, the Act itself did not provide any guidance on how this membership was to be determined. So individual BIA officers, or agents as they were known, at the various reservations were given a great deal of leeway in how they determined who was an Indian and who was not. In looking back at historical records, there are significant variances in how this was applied, and in looking at roles, you'll find different family members based on their status being treated differently. Many times American Indians were not formally married, and so if an agent went there and a couple was not married, but they were both Indian, that child was often marked as half. Sometimes you would find that they would follow the typical European concept of male progenitor, and within a family where you had an unmarried couple, the male children were marked as full blood, but the female children were marked as half. So there were quite a bit of discrepancies in that early blood quantum determination. Again, many of the tribes were nomadic, and you would have small groups of Indians that were in a territory that they were not usually affiliated with, that were then incorporated in that other tribe. So for a specific example, there was a small band of Sioux that were in the territory that was reserved for Crow Indians, and they were put on the Crow Indian roll. So it was just simply who was there when they were there and who the BIA agent believed was Indian. Sometimes it was even determined that you were too light complected to be Indian, so you were marked as a half-breed or not at all. So these early rolls were rife with errors, and again, one of the underlying intents was, as tribal members reproduced and remarried and intermingled with non-Indians, that eventually the blood quantum would breed out and then there would cease to be Indians. The General Allotment Act, it was to create that sense of individual identity, that I care for my own, I create my own wealth, I take care of my own, where before there was a greater sense of tribal community, about shared resources, that the land was used as a whole. The thought was if the Indians were separated from their tribal loyalties, that they would also begin to thrive in the broader American culture. The cultural impact of the Allotment Act is that Indian land was opened to outside speculation. Non-tribal members could now purchase land that was intended for Indians, that was previously prohibited and closed due to the trust status of the land. Indians were often given parcels without any access to water, and many did not have the capital or the resources to afford to farm the land. Institutionalized blood quantum was a method, again, to distribute tribal benefits, not just land, and it expedited the loss of tribal cultural norms, history, and connection that occurred by undermining group unity and left many Indians homeless and far more destitute than before. So while the goal was to create a greater opportunity for tribal members to have independence, it was without the structure that would have been necessary for it to succeed had it had a chance to succeed. You had individual Indians who were able to make a go of farming, and you still have families who farm the same land that their original allottee started. You can go back and look at some of those records and see those names go down through inheritance. However, for many Indians, this was far too quick of a transition. They didn't know how to farm. These land parcels were not made with the thought of what would be farmed, what access to water they would have. Again, this was during a time period when America was suffering a depression. You had individuals of American Indians who had little capital or little money, and so to get the equipment to farm was quite a burden for many of them because the land was no longer in trust. Many of the Indians, out of desperation and starvation, sold the land, and that's how you ended up with so many Indians homeless. One of the most interesting and illustrative examples of how this Allotment Act opened up individual tribal members to speculation and homelessness occurred on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. Many Indians would go to the local trading post and take credit for food and various supplies. The owner of that trading post was very good friends with the local BIA agent. When individual Indians had enough of a debt that they owed that particular trading post owner, he would then go to the BIA and say, "This Indian owes me this much money and I would like the allotment." And then that allotment, because it was no longer in trust status, that it was an individual allotment, then he would be able to take that in payment for their credit. This, again, is one of the most striking examples, but many of them just happened out of necessity and need. Again, where during the Depression, with little access to capital, you have Indians who are suffering from extreme prejudice at that time. So it wasn't like they could easily borrow money from banks. I will now move into Section 3, Life in the Boarding Schools, where we will cover U.S. policy and attitudes regarding children and families, and specific policies meant to put children in formal boarding schools separated from their family. In 1819, there was the Civilization Act. The 1819 Civilization Act was considered progressive at the time. This is most embodied by the phrase, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Missionary schools were funded to provide moral education to American Indians. The mandate was to indoctrinate Indian children into white American culture. It was based on the belief that separation from families would aid in this process. The first boarding school was the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. It was designed as a regimented military school. Almost 3,000 Indian children from Montana attended Carlisle. Right now, there is a historical movement to look at the history of the experience of American Indian children in boarding schools, which had a significant impact on Indians and Indian families, and how the understanding of child rearing, how you interrelate as people, was impacted by the experience of those children in those boarding schools and the separation from their families. Early Indian boarding school policy was similar to that of the allotment policy, which the thought was separation from tribe and tribal identity would help individual American Indians succeed and be more integrated into the larger American culture. The Allotment Act was meant to separate individual Indians from their larger tribal identity. The boarding school was meant to separate Indian children from their tribal families, with the thought that they would achieve greater indoctrination and assimilation with the larger culture and be more successful. The United States provided money for various entities and agencies to provide these boarding schools. There was not a whole lot of direction. You had some early churches, including the Seventh-day Adventists, who participated in this, who would do day schools, but the pressure was ultimately to have boarding schools so that that separation could be complete. Again, Carlisle was the earliest school. It was designed militarily. Lots of schools had discretion on how they set up the structure. That one was designed militarily. I introduced myself earlier as Georgette Hogan-Bojo. One of my ancestors went to the school of Carlisle. Part of the assimilation process was to give these various Indian students a European-sounding name. Because he was born in the month of July, is what my family has told me, he was given the name George Washington. And I've heard the story from many other Indians that a soldier thought a particular Indian child was cute or charming and they'd let them have their last name. So that's the story that's been handed to me about how my ancestor became George Washington Hogan when he attended Carlisle. hence my name, Georgette Hogan-Bojo. Life in the boarding schools. Some attendance was voluntary, but the BIA was involved in forcibly rounding up the majority of children who attended these schools. More than 350 schools were part of this system. Examples in Montana are Fort Shaw, St. Peter's, and Bonds. St. Libre Mission School was founded in 1884 and is still in existence. These schools had historically harsh conditions. The children were used for domestic and physical labor. Many children died, were buried in unmarked graves, and parents were often not informed of their deaths. The exact number of children placed in Indian boarding schools is not known. Approximately 20,000 in 1900, but that number tripled by 1925. I work in the dependency and neglect arena. I represent tribes and ICWA matters. And as this history has been discussed with various service providers, I often get the question of why didn't parents object, or why did parents send their students to these schools? Again, some attendance was voluntary, but these parents were often seeking to have their children have a greater opportunity for education. Many of them were suffering from poverty and homelessness, and they saw the schools as an opportunity for their children to have food, to have shelter, and to be warm. Again, these schools were very harsh. Oftentimes, parents did not find out when they died, or they would find out when an older student graduated and returned home and would tell them that their child passed away. In looking at records, the record keeping regarding the occurrence of these children's deaths, the basis for these deaths, is widely varied without little regulation at the time. My coworker did some research into a family member who had been at one of the boarding schools, and as she was looking at their records in which they marked why students passed away, one such designation that she saw in a boarding school was the child died from eating too much candy. There is a movement in America to address the experience that American Indian children had in the early boarding schools, identify where their family members are buried, and try to repatriate them home. In front of you, you will see a picture of an early recording of what a group of children, a family of children, looked like before they went into a boarding school, and then the picture of their improved appearance in the wider cultural norms of cut hair and suits. Again, these conditions were harsh. They were trained to do various physical labor. You see here in front of you a picture at the Paris Indian School of, and is now the Sherman Indian High School, of various Indian girls being trained to be laundresses. You also see here a picture, early picture of Carlisle and all the students that attended Carlisle. Again, the conditions were very harsh. You would have children who were punished for speaking their language. You would have children who had never had their hair cut. The routines were significantly different. The food was different again in what they experienced. And for many of the boarding schools, the thought was complete separation was the best way to assimilate them. So you had children who were removed from their parents very young, who did not see their family for years. As I stated earlier, I would have various individuals that I worked with say, gosh, you know, if my children were taken away, I would fight for my children. As the BIA did forcibly round up children, you had resistance among American Indian parents. You had some parents who would try to hide their children when they knew the BIA was coming to round them up. You would have parents who would move to where the boarding school was and set up their teepees or their temporary residences with the hope of seeing their children for just an hour a day or see them in passing. In front of you on the slide here is one of the most notorious signs of resistance. There was a period of time when the BIA arranged to try to gather a group of Indian children to place them in the boarding school down south. A group of Hopi men, of parents, resisted having their children taken to the boarding school, physically resisted. In 1884, 19 of them were sent to Alcatraz. And in the papers that sent them to Alcatraz, they were described as crafty redskins. These men were jailed for 1 year before they were released, but there are no clear records of how many died in Alcatraz and how many ultimately were able to return home. And again, their crime was to resist their children being taken to a boarding school. You had projects that continued as far on in policy with the Indian Adoption Project from 1957 to 1968. Again, it was considered progressive. The BIA and Child Welfare League of America actively sought to place American Indian children in white homes to save children from the reservation. This project was viewed as progressive in its effort because the thought was it was to combat racism in adoption. That the thought was Indian children are just as worthy of these superior homes as others. During this time period, 25 to 35% of all American Indians were removed from their native homes. There were lots of different reasons that these children were removed from their homes at that time period. Again, because of the history, you had many Indian families who were afraid of receiving services, afraid of being involved. So now we will be transitioning into an era of change to discuss the way that as time went on, the U.S. had evolved policies in how they dealt with what was conceived of the Indian problem as Indians who were on reservations struggled with income disparities, health disparities, and overall poverty. One of the first policy changes was the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. It reversed the traditional policy of assimilation, and it focused on strengthening tribes and encouraged education as a way to improve the life of individual American Indians. It prohibited further allotment of Indian lands, except for in Alaska, and it prohibited taking lands away from the tribe without consent. It was described as the Indian New Deal to improve living conditions of Indians by promoting tribal governments. Today, you have several tribes that still have as their governing document a IRA constitution. During this time period, the United States government developed model governing documents that many tribes adopted and still live by today. There are tribes who started out as what is commonly called as an IRA tribe that have since modified their governing documents, but there are still tribes that live under this type of document, and it's a living, breathing document that they use to successfully govern themselves. This is, again, a sea change. The thought was by enhancing tribes and their ability to govern themselves, that they would be best situated to change and improve the lifestyle. This was one of the earliest shifts in overall United States policy to recognizing what is commonly called or has developed into what is known as Indian self-determination. There are some swings in United States tribal policy back and forth between what was the earlier viewpoint of how to deal with Indians struggling with assimilation, experiencing poverty, and of assimilation, of separation from tribal identity and tribal family, to again the one that was first embodied in the IRA of enhancement of tribal sovereignty, enhancement of tribal identity, and enhancement of tribal autonomy. That the way that the United States has chosen to deal with Indians has shifted throughout history. of a wave back and forth. You had in the 50s, and I won't talk about it too much because it did not impact Montana, but did significantly impact other tribal nations and other states of the termination era, which again went back to the thought that tribes are best served by not being connected to their tribal identity, where whole tribes and their trust reservation land was set aside. That also, after a series of years, was determined to be a failure in the objectives, because that, again, had a similar outcome as the Allotment Act, which did not improve the prosperity of American Indians, but instead increased their poverty and disparities. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 authorized trust status of remaining allotments to continue until Congress provided otherwise, authorized the Secretary of Interior to take lands into trust for tribes and tribal members, and was highly challenged by states based on loss of tax base. Again, the Allotment Act led to significant loss of tribal land and homelessness, so the Indian Reorganization Act set up a way for land to come back into the protected federal status of trust, and for tribes to take that land back into common tribal ownership. It was an unfunded portion of the Indian Reorganization Act, but it allowed that to occur. It also stopped what was known as forced fee patents under the allotment era. So the individual Indians could get allotments, and then a BIA agent under the Allotment Act could determine that that individual Indian was assimilated enough that it should no longer be in trust, but it should be in fee. That could be based on if they could sign their name. And then that was when it was moved into what's called a forest fee patent, and that's what allowed that individual Indian to sell the land. Again, the Allotment Act was meant to divide up the reservation and allocate parcels to individual Indians. It also had a provision in it that would allow the extra land to be parceled out and available for homesteading. The Crows were always a small tribe, and they were so devastated by smallpox that when they learned about the Allotment Act, they were concerned about the actual available population to receive those allotments. So they went back to Washington, D.C., and were successfully able to lobby that the Crow Reservation not be opened to homesteading. Many reservations lost significant land to homesteading, but again, Crow, through its political activism, was able to avoid that, again, because of how devastating the smallpox epidemic was. This picture is circa 1920. George Hogan, Whitehead, with his wife Helen Goes Ahead on the left, and a friend, Rose, were second-generation reservation Crow. Helen died young, and her mother, Pretty Shield, raised their children. Pretty Shield was a medicine woman, and a book was written about her by Frank E. Linderman. Helen's father, Goes Ahead, was one of the chief scouts for Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. In front of you here, the Crow Indian delegation that did go back to Washington, D.C. in 1914. And if you look in the second row, you can see George Hogan there. Another policy that was meant to deal with the challenges that the tribal population suffered, that was a change in the attitude from assimilation and integration, was the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975. You will often hear tribal members call this ISDA for short. This act sought to guarantee protection of sovereignty through a policy of self-determination, and tribes can contract to provide tribal services that would otherwise be provided through BIA or IHS, and these are in shorthand referred to as 638 programs. This allows tribes to provide direct services that would normally be provided by a federal employee to themselves. It allows Although tribes are still mandated to follow various federal policy, it does allow a degree of self-determination and setting of policies within those programs. As tribes have been limited in their ability to tax and generate revenue in the way that many governments would otherwise generate revenue for governance, these 638 agreements are critical for tribes to be able to provide direct services to themselves. So this was a significant policy in assisting tribes in asserting and growing their sovereignty. So here you see a picture of another tribal member in Montana, Frank Buck, circa 1960, his traditional name Eagle Plume, along with his wife Lena Buck. They were first generation residents on the Assiniboine Reservation at Fort Belknap. In the center, they are with what would be called an in-law in general European culture, but would be considered a daughter for them, Elma Hogan Snell. Frank was one of the few Assiniboine tribal members who was successful in farming and ranching. They kept their language hidden from the younger generation to avoid retaliation, but they retained much of their culture. Frank Buck would raise his hand to the sky facing east and pray every day. If you look at the picture, you'll see his wife, Lena Buck, still dressed in traditional Native dress. This was what a lot of Native women wore till the day they died, even upon assimilation of many dress for younger generations. My great-grandmother wore moccasins till the day she died, and also wore the scarf, which was very traditional for older Crow women. Another policy that was adopted that recognized tribal sovereignty and connection as a way to improve the disparities that American Indians experienced was the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. It's commonly known as ICWA, which many of you as service providers to tribal families and children may have heard of. ICWA recognized tribes' interest in their families and children. ICWA recognized the sovereignty, self-determination, and trust responsibility to right wrongs regarding treatment of American Indians. Testimony to Congress was very compelling from individuals who experienced disconnection from their tribal communities. This was a result of some of the earlier policies brought forward in the Indian Adoption Project, as well as general removal of children by social services. Additionally, one of the things that was very compelling that is often not talked about that I think is important to recognize in ICWA is that it's easy to think that ICWA is about the tribe's interest in their children, which it clearly is, as testimony presented that if removals continued at the rate that they were continuing, or that they were occurring at the time of ICWA, that tribes would be non-existent in 3 to 4 generations. So it was a type of modern genocide through legal means. Further, again, parents' interests, which the United States Supreme Court has recognized as a right of parents to raise their children, that ICWA was meant to offset the biases that led children being removed from their parents at a higher rate than non-Indians, at a significantly higher rate. But it was also meant to recognize a child's right to belong to their tribe and to remain with their family. Again, some of the most compelling testimony in the congressional record are those of adult adoptees, their experiences in adoptive homes, about what it meant to be separated from their culture, to try to reconnect with the culture at a later time, as well as the very high suicide rate of American Indian children in foster care. It's difficult for some states to apply it on a regular basis where they have a smaller Indian population, as there are different standards and different requirements. And the dependency and neglect arena, unfortunately, is one that is of short time frames and challenging caseloads. I would feel very safe in saying that probably most of the states in America do not allocate the amount of money that needs to be allocated to social services to truly heal families. 40 years, disparities still remain after its passage. In 2019, American Indians represented 7% of Montana's total population, and American Indian children represented 12.3% of Montana's total population of children. However, in 2019, 33% of American Indian children were placed in the Montana Child Protection Services foster care system, and in 2020, the percentage rose to 35%. Nationwide, American Indian children are overrepresented in the foster care system at a rate of 2.6 times greater than their proportion in the general population. The focus of social services still remains on out-of-home placement and adoption rather than reunification, and the federal government spends 10 times more on all foster care and adoption than reunification. The overall suicide rate in Montana was 25 per 100,000 residents in 2020. The suicide rate for American Indians was 33.75 per 100,000 residents in 2020. The suicide rate for American Indian males aged 16 to 24 was 93.99 per 100,000 residents in 2020, and 17.6% of American Indian youth in Montana high schools attempted suicide in 2021. Montana ranks fourth highest in the U.S. with a poverty rate for American Indians of 32.41% in 2023. Montana's general poverty rate is 11.9%. 20.7% of Montana American Indian students had their first drink of alcohol before age 13, and 55.1% of Montana American Indian students have used marijuana. Montana's American Indian students experience high levels of sadness. 42.9% of those living on the reservation, 39.4% of those living off the reservation. This is compared to 28.5% of all students. I have spent a large majority of my career as an attorney working in the dependency and neglect arena in various fields. I have served as the attorney representing tribes in Indian Child Welfare Act matters. I have represented the state of Montana as a county attorney in dependency and neglect matters. I have served as a guardian ad litem representing the best interests of children within that system. It is tempting to think that because the Indian Child Welfare Act was adopted over 40 years ago, that the attitudes towards race and bias has changed significantly, and that it is no longer necessary to have protections of that level. However, the statistics would bear out that there are still struggles that need to be looked at very carefully in the welfare and well-being of Indian children in the system. We will now move on to Section 5, Montana Reservations. Again, this section is not meant to be exhaustive in Montana reservations, but is intended to give you a context of what reservations exist in Montana, how they are different just a little bit. It is meant to be a starting point for hopefully what would be a lifelong inquiry into the lives of your neighbors. Montana tribes, prior to Indian reservations, the majority of tribes in the Great Plains were nomadic. Tribes had designated territorial areas, but did not profess ownership of land in the way that Europeans conceived of it as static and individual. They generally considered land communal property and did not embrace individual land ownership. Here on the map you can see the Indian reservations that are currently there. In the larger colors surrounding them, it marks what was generally considered their traditional Aboriginal territory. So most reservations are, like I said, most tribal populations were nomadic. They followed game, which meant that they had to travel significant distances to follow that game of elk, buffalo, deer. They also were hunters and gatherers, would follow the streams. They would move to different areas based on weather and the time of year. So they used a wide area to sustain themselves. And so you can see that reflected in the larger colors of where they would traditionally roam within the current map of Montana and their current reservation area. The Blackfeet Reservation is located in northwest Montana on the High Line near East Glacier. It was established in 1851. The Blackfeet did not attend the Fort Laramie negotiation. The current size is 1.5 million acres, approximately 15,560 enrolled members, of about whom 7,000 live on the reservation. The current enrollment criteria is 1/4 Blackfeet blood by lineage to be eligible for enrollment. The Crow Reservation is located in south central Montana, 60 miles south of Billings. The original boundaries consisted of 38 million acres in Montana, Dakota, and Wyoming territories. The current size is 2.3 million acres. There are approximately 11,000 enrolled members, of whom about 7,900 live on the reservation. Current enrollment, 1/4 Crow blood and born to an enrolled member of the tribe. The Flathead Reservation is located in the northwest part of Montana in the Flathead Valley. It was established in 1855. It's made up of the Salish and Kootenai tribes. Its original size was 22 million acres. Its current size is 1.2 million acres. There are approximately 7,700 enrolled members. Approximately 5,000 live on the reservation. Their current enrollment criteria is 1/5 blood quantum and a child of an enrolled tribal member. The Fort Belknap Reservation is located in north central Montana, 50 miles east of Havre. It was established for the Gros Ventre and Assiniboine tribes in 1888. Its current size is 650,000 acres. It has approximately 6,700 enrolled members, of about whom 3,429 live on the reservation. The current enrollment criteria is 1/4 Indian blood born to an enrolled member who lives on the reservation at the time of the child's birth. The Fort Peck Reservation is located in the northeast corner of Montana and includes the communities of Wolf Point and Poplar. It was established in 1851. The original size was 2,094,144 acres. Its current size is 2 million acres. There are approximately 11,790 enrolled members, of whom about 6,000 live on the reservation. The current enrollment criteria is 1/4 Assiniboine or Sioux blood born to an enrolled member of the tribe. The Northern Cheyenne Reservation is located in south central Montana, 112 miles southeast of Billings. It was established in 1884 through executive order. The Northern Cheyenne were forcibly relocated to Oklahoma in 1877 upon the discovery of gold in their territory at the time. A band of Northern Cheyenne were returned to Montana in 1878, although many were captured and imprisoned in Fort Robinson. The current size is 440,000 acres. There are approximately 11,270 enrolled members, of about whom 5,012 live on the reservation. The current enrollment criteria are all children born to enrolled members living on the reservation at the time of birth, lineal descendants with 1/4 blood, or all children born to enrolled male member. The Rocky Boy Reservation is located on the High Line in north central Montana, 29 miles from Havre. It was established in 1916 for the Chippewa and Cree. Its original size was 56,035 acres, but was increased after the initial land set aside by the U.S. government. Its current size is approximately 122,000 acres. There are approximately 6,177 enrolled members, of about whom 2,500 live on the reservation. The current enrollment criteria are children born to an enrolled member of the tribe who is a resident of the reservation at the time of birth, and children born to an enrolled member of the tribe who is a non-resident must have 1/2 or more Indian blood. Members can lose membership if they are away from the reservation for more than 10 years. The Little Shell Chippewa tribe is located in Great Falls, Montana. The Little Shell come from the Pembina Band of Chippewa Indians. commonly known as Turtle Mountain. Some Chippewa Cree were federally recognized as part of the formation of the Rocky Boy Reservation. The Little Shell were recognized by the state of Montana in 2003 and the U.S. in 2019. They have approximately 4,500 enrolled members. Their current enrollment is a minimum of 1/8 Chippewa blood. Here in front of you, you have a current map of the different reservations in Montana that show you their approximate size and location. Thank you for listening to me today. My closing thoughts on the overall presentation and the history of American Indians, my personal viewpoint is that the Indian problem, as it has been treated by the government and the larger population, of the issues of poverty, of health disparities, has historically been shown to poorly be served by separating tribal members from their tribal identity and their tribal connections. It is easy when you drive through a reservation and see the poverty, you see the littering, you see the homes that don't look like the broader community, to think that the problem is the reservation. But history shows us that separation from tribal families and tribal identity does not help Indians, but only increases those disparities. As you work with Indian children, I hope that you can separate Indian identity from the trauma that has been historically experienced by Indians as a population. I would like to say thank you to Elk River Law Office, Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders, and Yellowstone Boys and Girls Ranch for bringing this presentation to you today. Thank you.